That night changed everything. It was supposed to be another ordinary visit. A warm meal, familiar laughter, and the quiet comfort of home. But as the hours stretched on, something shifted. His lingering touch, the intensity in his eyes, the way his voice softened. It all blurred the lines between us in a way I couldn't ignore. Now, I'm left with the memory of a moment we'll never talk about, but one we both felt. Our bond has changed, becoming something deeper, something more complicated. How do you move forward when everything you thought you knew is no longer the same? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The late autumn air bit gently at my skin as I stepped out of my car, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot accompanying me to the door. The porch light was already on. Dad had a knack for anticipating my arrival, even when I hadn't texted ahead. I rang the bell out of habit, though I had the key, and within moments, the door swung open to reveal Michael's familiar, warm smile. "Alex, you're early," he said, his voice rich with that steady calm I'd always found comforting.
"I'm punctual," he teased.
Stepping inside and shrugging off my jacket. The house smelled faintly of roasted garlic and a hint of the cologne he'd worn for years. Something clean, with a sharp undertone that lingered. We fell into our usual rhythm. A quick hug, then the exchange of light banter as I kicked off my shoes and followed him into the kitchen. The small, intimate house felt like an extension of him. Tidy, a little old-fashioned, but undeniably warm. He handed me a glass of water, as he always did, and we settled at the table. "How was your week?" Michael asked, his eyes lingering on me a moment longer than expected. I noticed it, but I brushed it off. He was always attentive, maybe a little too much so since Mom left. "It was fine," I said, fiddling with the edge of the placemat. "Work is work, you know how it goes." His laugh came easily, filling the room like sunlight. "Sounds thrilling. Same old here. I've been fixing up the gutters. Finally got to it after 2 years of procrastination." We both laughed, the sound bouncing off the walls. It was the kind of laughter only family could share, born from countless shared jokes and memories. Later, we grabbed takeout from that old Thai place I used to beg him to take me to as a kid. Sitting cross-legged on the couch with the takeout cartons between us, it felt like nothing had changed. The years since Mom's departure had brought us closer, and though the circumstances weren't ideal, I couldn't deny the bond we'd built. "I don't know how they managed to keep this place exactly the same," I said, pointing at the pad CEW with my chopsticks. "It tastes exactly like it did when I was 10. Michael shrugged, smirking. "Maybe they froze a batch 20 years ago just for you." "Disgusting," I shot back, laughing as he snatched a spring roll off my plate. But as the evening stretched on, I started to notice little things. The way his gaze lingered when I laughed. The subtle softness in his expression when he looked at me. It wasn't overt. Nothing I could call out directly, but it was enough to send a ripple of unease through me. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked at one point, trying to keep my tone light. "Of course," he said, too quickly, brushing off the question with a wave of his hand. Why wouldn't I be? I didn't press further. We talked about mundane things instead. Upcoming plans, the weather, a funny story he'd heard at work. It was the kind of conversation we'd had 100 times before, but tonight, it felt like there was something unspoken between us. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. When I finally got up to leave, it was nearing midnight. As I stood by the door, jacket in hand, Michael hesitated. "Are you sure you don't want to stay the night? It's late." I glanced outside, where the wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the darkened street. "I don't know. I don't want to impose." "You're never an imposition, Alex," he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that caught me off guard. For a moment I considered saying no, but the thought of driving home in the cold, lonely dark didn't appeal. "Okay," I said finally, "just for the night." Michael's shoulders relaxed, and he smiled. "Good. I'll set up the couch for you." The couch was as familiar as the house itself, worn but comfortable, with the kind of creases and imperfections that spoke of years of use. Michael handed me a blanket, the same thick, navy blue one he'd always kept folded on the back of the couch. "You sure you don't want to take the bed?" he asked, hovering like he always did when he thought I wasn't comfortable enough. "I'm fine," I said, adjusting the blanket around me. "You've been sleeping there for years. I'm not about to kick you out of it." "Fair enough." He lingered a moment longer, standing at the edge of the living room. "You need anything else?" "Just some peace and quiet so I can crash," I said with a teasing smile, though part of me was too aware of the way his gaze softened when he looked at me. He chuckled under his breath and finally stepped back. "All right, sleep well." As he disappeared down the hallway, the house settled into its familiar stillness. The faint ticking of the wall clock was the only sound, and though the couch wasn't the most luxurious sleeping spot, it felt right to be here. This house, his presence, was as close to home as I'd felt in a long time. The next morning, we fell into an easy rhythm, the kind that only comes with years of familiarity. Breakfast was a simple affair. Toast, scrambled eggs, and coffee. Michael didn't say much at first, focusing instead on the frying pan while I scrolled aimlessly on my phone. "Do you still talk to anyone from high school?" he asked, breaking the silence. The question caught me off guard. "Not really." "Why?" "Just wondering." He glanced over his shoulder at me, his expression unreadable. "You used to be so close to that one friend. What was her name?" "Melissa?" "Maria," I corrected, smiling faintly at the memory. "And yeah, we kind of lost touch after college. Life happens." "Shame." She seemed nice. There was something nostalgic in his tone, a wistfulness that made me put down my phone. "Why bring her up now?" He shrugged, turning back to the stove. "I don't know. I guess I was thinking about how much things have changed. Not just with you, but everything." "Yeah, I guess they have." I stared at the steam curling from my coffee, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. Later that afternoon, we decided to clean out the garage. A task neither of us particularly enjoyed, but one that seemed inevitable. It was Michael's idea, of course, and though I protested at first, I quickly found myself lost in the boxes of old photographs and forgotten knickknacks. "Remember this?" I held up a faded Polaroid of us at the beach, me grinning with a popsicle in one hand while Michael squinted against the sun. He leaned over my shoulder, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. "I think that's the summer we almost lost the car keys in the sand." "Almost? You mean you did lose them?" I said with a laugh. "Details," he said, brushing it off with a smile that made me forget, for a moment, the subtle shifts I'd noticed the night before. By the time we'd finished sorting through the mess, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway. We sat on the porch steps, drinking water and watching the leaves scatter in the wind. "You've grown up so much," Michael said suddenly, his voice quiet. I turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Thanks? I think." He shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "I don't mean it like that. It's just, sometimes I forget you're not a kid anymore, that you've got your own life now." His words hung in the air, heavy with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Well, no matter how old I get, you'll always be my dad," I said, trying to lighten the mood. His smile widened, but there was something almost sad about it. "Yeah, I guess I will." The moment passed quickly, and we carried on with small talk, but as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted again. The way he looked at me wasn't quite the same, and the tone of his voice lingered in my mind long after the conversation had ended. The wind had picked up by the time dinner was done, whistling faintly through the edges of the windows. I stood in the kitchen, rinsing dishes as Michael leaned against the counter beside me, drying them off with a towel. We'd eaten leftovers from the fridge. Neither of us had much energy for anything more elaborate after the long day of cleaning and talking. "It's getting nasty out there," he remarked, glancing toward the window. I followed his gaze. The trees swayed under the weight of the wind, and the occasional gust rattled the window pane. "Guess it's a good thing I decided to stay." He smiled at that, a quiet sort of relief in his expression. I'd say so. Wouldn't want you driving in this. Once the dishes were done, we retreated to the living room. The couch was still made up as my bed, the blanket folded neatly at one end. Michael sat down first, patting the spot next to him. Come on, sit. You've earned a break. I hesitated for a moment before joining him, sinking into the worn cushions. We turned on the TV, flipping aimlessly through channels until we landed on an old sitcom we both liked. It didn't take long for us to start laughing at the familiar jokes, the tension from earlier in the day fading into the background. The hours slipped by, the room growing quieter as the night deepened. At some point, Michael stretched his legs out on the couch, shifting closer to me. It wasn't unusual for him to do that. We'd always been comfortable with each other. But tonight, the proximity felt different. I don't know how you're not tired, I said, glancing at the clock. It was well past 11. Guess I'm just used to late nights, he said, his voice softer now. He pulled the blanket over us, tucking it around my legs before settling back. I froze for a moment, surprised by the gesture, but I didn't pull away. It felt natural in some strange way, just another act of care, I told myself. The glow from the TV bathed the room in a soft, flickering light, casting shadows across his face. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye and caught him watching me. His expression was hard to read, a mix of something tender and something else I couldn't quite name. You all right? I asked, breaking the silence. Yeah, he said quickly, looking away. I'm fine. Just thinking. About what? He hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly where they rested on the edge of the couch. About how nice this is, having you here. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say, so I nodded, offering him a small smile. It is nice. Feels like old times. Yeah, he murmured, his gaze dropping to his hands. It does. The night stretched on, the TV becoming little more than background noise. Michael's arm brushed against mine as he adjusted his position, and I became acutely aware of how close we were. My heart gave a small, involuntary flutter, and I immediately chastised myself for it. Should we call it a night? I suggested, trying to keep my voice casual. Sure, he said, though he made no move to get up. I shifted to grab the remote, and as I did, his hand lightly grazed mine. It wasn't intentional, or at least I didn't think it was, but the touch lingered just a second too long. Sorry, he said, pulling his hand back. It's fine, I replied quickly, forcing a laugh to ease the tension. But the moment lingered, heavy and unspoken, as we sat there in the dim light. Eventually, Michael stood, stretching his arms over his head. I should get to bed, he said, though his voice lacked its usual energy. Yeah, I said, relieved for the break in tension. I'll get some sleep too. As he started toward the hallway, he hesitated, glancing back at me. Good night, Alex. Good night, I replied, watching him disappear into the shadows of the hallway. When I lay down on the couch, the blanket pulled snug around me. I couldn't shake the weight of the evening. Something had shifted between us tonight, something I didn't fully understand. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking, reading too much into small gestures. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. And as I drifted off to sleep, my thoughts tangled in the quiet moments we'd shared. I couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. The living room was dark and still when I woke, the hum of the fridge in the adjacent kitchen the only sound breaking the silence. I wasn't sure what had stirred me. Maybe the faint chill in the air, or the way the blanket had slipped halfway off my body. Blinking into the darkness, I reached for it, pulling it back up over my shoulders. That's when I noticed him. Michael was sitting in the armchair across from the couch, the glow of his phone casting faint shadows over his face. He wasn't scrolling or typing, just holding it, staring blankly at the screen as if lost in thought. Dad, I asked, my voice groggy. He startled slightly, his head snapping up to look at me. Sorry, he said quickly, setting the phone aside. Didn't mean to wake you. You didn't? I murmured, sitting up and rubbing my eyes. "What are you doing?" "Couldn't sleep." His voice was soft, almost apologetic, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed the lines of tension etched into his face. He looked tired, more than tired, worn. "You okay?" I asked, scooting to the edge of the couch. He nodded, though the gesture felt half-hearted. "Yeah, just thinking." There it was again, that vague answer, the one that always seemed to carry more weight than he let on. I studied him for a moment, the way his hands fidgeted in his lap, the way his gaze seemed to avoid mine. "Come here," I said impulsively, patting the couch. He hesitated, his expression flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Then, slowly, he rose from the chair and crossed the room, sinking down beside me. The couch shifted under his weight, and the blanket, still draped over my legs, was inadvertently pulled between us. He tugged it free, covering himself without a word. For a moment we just sat there, the silence stretching like a taut string. "What's on your mind?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Michael exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping. "You, mostly." The admission startled me. "Me? Why?" He glanced at me then, his eyes shadowed but intense. "I don't know. You're all grown up now, living your own life. I guess I've been thinking about how fast it all happened." His words stirred a strange, bittersweet ache in me. "It's not like I'm a stranger. I'm here all the time." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not the same." The vulnerability in his tone caught me off guard. I wasn't used to seeing him like this, so open, so raw. It made me uncomfortable, but not in a way that felt wrong. Just unfamiliar. I reached out, hesitating for only a second before placing my hand on his. His skin was warm, his fingers still fidgeting slightly beneath mine. "Hey," I said softly, "I'm not going anywhere. Okay? You'll always have me." Michael's eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between us. I wasn't sure what it was, gratitude, relief, or something deeper, but it lingered, heavy and undeniable. "Thanks," he murmured, his fingers finally stilling beneath mine. We stayed like that for a while, the room cloaked in quiet. My hand remained on his, and though I told myself it was just a comforting gesture, the weight of it felt like more. The lines between us blurred in that silence, and I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about our relationship. When he finally moved, it was subtle, just a small shift closer, his shoulder brushing mine. I didn't pull away, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the hour, or the way the shadows softened the edges of the room. Or maybe it was the way his presence, so steady and familiar, made me feel both safe and untethered all at once. "Do you ever miss her?" I asked suddenly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Michael frowned, his brow furrowing. "Your mom?" I nodded. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "Sometimes, but not in the way you'd think. It's more like, I miss the idea of her, the family we used to be." His words hit harder than I expected. "I get that. Do you?" he asked, his gaze searching mine. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I think so. I mean, it's hard to miss someone who wasn't really there, you know? But I miss what we could have had, maybe." Michael's hand tightened around mine, a brief, instinctive squeeze. "You turned out pretty amazing, despite everything." The compliment caught me off guard, my face warming. "Thanks." His eyes lingered on mine a moment longer, his hand still holding mine. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with something neither of us could name but both of us could feel. The moment stretched on, neither of us moving. Eventually, I shifted back, letting go of his hand as I pulled the blanket tighter around me. "I think we both need some sleep," I said, my voice shakier than I'd intended. Michael nodded, his gaze still on me. "Yeah, you're probably right." He stood slowly, pausing to place a hand on my shoulder. "Good night, Alex." "Good night," I whispered, watching him disappear down the hall once again. When I finally lay back down, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The closeness between us felt different now. Something I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. The night had grown colder by the time I woke again, though this time it wasn't the chill that stirred me. There was a presence, a warmth at the edge of the couch where I lay. As I blinked my eyes open, the faint glow of the hallway light revealed Michael sitting at the foot of the couch. His head turned slightly as if studying me. "Dad?" My voice was barely above a whisper, thick with sleep. "Sorry," he said quickly, shifting back slightly. "I didn't mean to wake you." "It's okay," I murmured, propping myself up on one elbow. "What's wrong?" For a moment, he didn't answer, his eyes flickering over me in the dim light. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I couldn't sleep. You should have just stayed in bed," I said, my tone soft, though a part of me wasn't sure I wanted him to leave. He chuckled lightly, though it sounded strained. Easier said than done. The room fell quiet again, the faint ticking of the wall clock the only sound between us. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was offering him. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "It's nothing. Just thinking too much, I guess." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. His presence felt heavier tonight, the weight of unspoken words settling between us like a fog. As I shifted to sit up fully, the blanket slipped from my shoulders, pooling around my waist. Michael reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against my arm as he pulled it back up. The touch lingered, longer than it should have, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. "Thanks," I said quietly, though my voice sounded distant to my own ears. He didn't respond, his hand still resting lightly on the edge of the blanket. For a moment, neither of us moved. The tension between us was palpable, thick enough to drown in. "Alex," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know you mean the world to me, right?" "Of course," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "You mean the world to me too." His gaze met mine, and there was something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Vulnerability, longing, something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. "I don't say it enough," he continued, his voice wavering slightly, "but I'm so proud of you, of the person you've become." The words hit me harder than I expected, a lump rising in my throat. "Thanks," I managed, my voice barely audible. He reached out then, his fingers brushing against mine. The gesture was so simple, so small, but it felt monumental in the quiet of the room. My instinct was to pull away, to break the moment before it could grow into something I couldn't understand. But I didn't move. Instead, I let his hand settle over mine, his touch warm and steady. "You're my everything, Alex," he said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. My chest tightened, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Gratitude, confusion, unease. His words felt both comforting and overwhelming, like a tide threatening to pull me under. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he continued, his thumb brushing lightly against the back of my hand. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "you don't have to say all this." "I do," he insisted, his grip on my hand tightening just a fraction. "I need you to know how much you mean to me." The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. I didn't know what to say, how to respond. My thoughts were a tangled mess, caught between the familiarity of his touch and the unsettling weight of his words. When he finally released my hand, the absence of his touch felt almost jarring. He leaned back slightly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I said quickly, though the words felt like a half-truth. He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "I just care about you so much, more than I can put into words." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "I know. I care about you too." The words hung between us, fragile and uncertain. I wanted to say more, to ask what he meant, but the fear of what his answer might be kept me silent. Eventually, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I should let you get some sleep," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, watching as he disappeared down the hallway once more. But even as the house fell silent again, the weight of the moment lingered, pressing down on me like a storm cloud. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling as my mind replayed his words, his touch, his expression. Something had changed between us tonight, something I couldn't ignore. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting soft streaks of gold across the living room. I stirred slowly, the warmth of the blanket cocooning me. For a moment, I forgot where I was, but the faint smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen quickly grounded me. I sat up, stretching, and noticed the faint imprint of a blanket on the armchair across from the couch. Michael must have returned during the night, sitting there again, though now it was empty. "Morning." His voice came from the doorway. I turned to see him standing there, a steaming mug in each hand. He looked more rested than he had last night, though there was still a quiet weight in his expression. "Morning," I replied, my voice raspy from sleep. He handed me a mug, and I took it gratefully, the heat of the ceramic warming my fingers. We sat together on the couch, sipping in silence for a moment. The air between us felt lighter, but not quite the same as it had before. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked finally, breaking the quiet. I nodded, though it wasn't entirely true. "Yeah. You?" "Eventually," he said, offering me a faint smile. The conversation was easy at first. Mundane topics like the weather, work, and what groceries he needed to pick up later. But underneath it all, there was an undercurrent of something unsaid, lingering from the night before. "I was thinking," Michael said suddenly, his tone more serious. "About?" I asked, setting my mug down on the coffee table. "About what I said last night." He glanced at me, his expression a mixture of hesitation and resolve. "I didn't mean to put that on you, Alex. I don't want you to feel like, I don't know, like you have to carry any of that." His words caught me off guard. "You didn't?" I said quickly, though the memory of his touch, his words, still lingered in my mind. "It's okay. Really. I just worry sometimes," he continued, his voice quieter now, "that I lean on you too much, that I'm asking for more than I should." "You're not," I insisted, though my own uncertainty made the words feel hollow. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from knowing someone so well, from understanding the weight of their unspoken thoughts. "I don't want to lose what we have," he said finally, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You won't?" I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "No matter what." He looked at me then, and the faintest hint of a smile curved his lips. "Thanks, Alex. That means a lot." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. The tension from the night before was still there, but it felt different now, less sharp, more subdued. After breakfast, we fell back into our usual routine. Michael washed the dishes while I dried them, our movements synchronized from years of habit. It felt normal, even comforting, though the memory of last night lingered in the back of my mind. As I prepared to leave, gathering my things by the front door, Michael stood nearby, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Thanks for staying," he said, his voice soft. "Of course," I replied, smiling faintly. "You don't have to thank me for that." He hesitated, his gaze flickering to mine. "I just want you to know how much it means to me, having you here." "I know," I said, my voice quieter now. "It means a lot to me too." We hugged then, a simple gesture that felt both familiar and charged with unspoken emotion. His arms tightened around me for a moment longer than usual before he let go. As I stepped outside, the crisp morning air greeted me, the sun shining brightly despite the chill. I glanced back at the house, at Michael standing in the doorway with a small smile on his face. "Drive safe," he called out. "I will," I replied, waving as I climbed into my car. The drive home was quiet, the roads empty save for the occasional car. My thoughts were anything but still, though, replaying the events of the night before and the conversation that morning. Something had shifted between us. I couldn't deny that. But what that meant, or how it would shape our relationship moving forward, I didn't know. All I knew was that the bond we shared felt deeper now, more complicated but also more unshakable. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was ours. The house looked smaller in the rearview mirror as I drove away, the morning sunlight making the familiar silhouette blur at the edges. I'd been here so many times, but this visit felt different, like something had shifted irrevocably, though I couldn't quite name what. The quiet hum of the engine filled the car, my thoughts circling back to Michael's words from the night before. The way he'd looked at me, the way his voice had carried so much weight, as though every word had been carefully chosen. "You're my everything." Those words echoed in my mind, stirring something deep and complicated within me. They had been spoken with such sincerity, such tenderness, that I couldn't dismiss them, even if I wanted to. When I reached the first stoplight, I glanced at my hands on the steering wheel. They were steady, but my chest still felt tight, like I was holding my breath. Michael's presence lingered with me, as though he was still sitting beside me, his hand resting lightly over mine. I pulled into a parking lot, cutting the engine and leaning back in the seat. The morning chill seeped through the car, but I barely noticed. My thoughts were too tangled, too focused on what had changed between us. There was no denying it. Our bond wasn't the same as it had been before. Felt deeper now, more complicated. It wasn't something I fully understood, and maybe I never would. But as I sat there, the sun rising higher in the sky, I realized I wasn't afraid of it. Whatever this was, whatever it became, I would face it one moment at a time. Because no matter what, Michael was still my family. And I was his.